In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 8, in which we discuss macroeconomics, where overall in regards to this chapter, we seek to discuss macroeconomics in order to define business cycles and conclude by introducing the ADAS model, where in regards to today's discussion on macroeconomics, we will begin with some preliminaries in order to define macroeconomics and conclude with our two branches of macroeconomics in the form of economic growth and business cycles. To begin with our preliminaries, thus far in our development of economics, we have motivated the study of economics, in which our starting premise was agent wants are unlimited, but resources are finite, such that not all wants can go fulfilled, from which we developed the tools in order to examine the product market of a single good or service, where we saw that the price and quantity levels for a good or service were determined through the forces of product demand and product supply, from which we developed three macroeconomic indicators in the form of GDP, unemployment, and inflation, where GDP allowed us to measure aggregate output, unemployment allowed us to examine a problem that an economy faces in terms of producing below potential, and inflation allowed us to view an additional problem that an economy deals with, where at the macro level, this leads to uncertainty, which can then correspond to a change in aggregate demand or aggregate supply, and at the micro level, this has the consequence of redistributing income and wealth through the price, income, and wealth effects of inflation. So now we would like to use these ideas in order to develop a framework for the aggregate product market of an economy, which will then allow us to examine how real output and the average price level are determined within the aggregate product market. But before proceeding to developing such a framework, we should first give some background on two major areas in macroeconomics and which we will be focusing on. So, to do that, let us recall our definition for economics, which is the study of choice subject to constraints. Whose choices? Consumers and firms. And what constraints? Consumers are limited in how much income and time they have, and their constraint is the income budget constraint, whereas firms are limited by the factors of production they have, and their constraint is the production constraint. So given this definition and our set of agents and agent problems, we then distinguish between microeconomics and macroeconomics as two major branches of economics, where microeconomics is the study of individual consumer, firm, and market problems, in which we seek to study how consumers make choices, how firms produce goods given varying market structures, as well as how the price and quantity levels for a particular good or service are determined. Whereas macroeconomics is the aggregate analog to microeconomics, where we'll be concerned with aggregate level decision making from consumers and firms, and considering overall market problems. Where with the study of aggregate level decision making and markets that comes with macroeconomics, GDP, unemployment, and inflation are key indicators we turn to for study and for examining performance of an economy, where below we have graphical representations of our three indicators. We have real GDP on the left for the United States from 1960 to early 2021. In the middle, we have the unemployment rate for the United States from 1960 to early 2021. And on the right, we have the inflation rate for the United States from 1960 to early 2021, where in regards to real GDP, we observe that real GDP seems to be increasing at a nearly constant rate, but there are some rough patches or noise along the way of this constant growth rate. In regards to unemployment, we see that there's not as clear as a pattern as there is with real GDP, but there are periods in which unemployment seems to be low, and there seems to be periods where unemployment seems to be pretty high. Similar, in regards to inflation, there doesn't seem to be a clear-cut pattern, but there seems to be periods in which inflation is pretty high, and there's also alternative periods in which inflation seems to be pretty low. And if we were to look a bit more carefully, there may seem to be an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation that we seek to explore, and this coincides nicely with our definition of full employment, in which we considered both unemployment levels as well as average price level change levels in the form of price stability. But for now, our attention will be turned towards real GDP for the moment, where once again we have our graphical representation below. And by considering real GDP, this will allow us to examine the two major branches of macroeconomics and will allow us to see how all three of our indicators are related through our framework of the aggregate product market. Where once again, in regards to this graphical representation, this is real GDP for the United States from 1960 until early 2021, where we see that real GDP is increasing at a nearly constant rate, but along the way there are some rough patches that keep it from being at a constant rate. So then in regards to real GDP, our two main observations are that real GDP seems to be growing on average at a constant rate, and that there is some noise along the way of this constant growth rate. So one way that we can handle this is to think about real GDP in terms of two components. That is the combination of a trend and a cycle. This will yield us the two major branches of macroeconomics in terms of either studying the trend or the cyclical component of real GDP. Where in regards to studying the trend component, that is that constant growth rate, this will correspond to economic growth, which focuses on increases in real GDP or expansions of the production possibilities of an economy, where the primary focus on economic growth is to determine what are the reasons for an economy to grow and to be able to forecast economic growth as well. Where here below we have a graphical representation of real GDP for the United States from 1966 until 2021 with forecasted values, where this blue line represents real GDP and this green dashed line represents that trend or constant growth rate of real GDP. And what we would like to do is explain why an economy is growing and growing at this particular constant growth rate, and having such a narrative in place will then allow us to forecast the values of real GDP and seeing eventually how well they perform against actual values, which we see here we have forecasted values for real GDP as well. Where in regards to the story behind economic growth, we can do this by examining the PPF of an economy. We'll recall that the production possibilities frontier is going to be all the possible combination of goods and services that an economy in this case can produce, given their aggregate technology and their overall labor force. Where we have our graphical representation on the right, we have service goods on the vertical axis, consumption goods on the horizontal axis. We have our downward sloping nonlinear red curve representing this economy's PPF, where we have seen that the PPF is determined by the labor force or aggregate technology, such that if there is a permanent improvement in production technology or permanent increase in the labor force of an economy due to immigration or people entering the labor force for the first time by coming of age, this would then correspond to a rightward shift in the production possibilities frontier, which increases the possible combination of goods and services that this economy can produce, which then corresponds to an increase in real GDP. Whereas on the other hand, if there's a permanent reduction in an economy's labor force due to retirement out of the labor force or immigration out of an economy, or reduction in production technology due to, say, a natural disaster, this would then correspond to a leftward shift in the production possibilities frontier, which reduces the possible combinations of goods and services, which then corresponds to a decline in real GDP for an economy. So then now we proceed on to business cycles, which is going to correspond to that noisy component or cyclical component of real GDP, where we can define business cycles as alternating periods of economic growth and contractions. An alternative way that I'll state that is short-run fluctuations in real GDP or real output. And as mentioned, this deals with examining the cyclical portion of real GDP, where we seek to look at what are the reasons for real GDP for not growing at a particularly constant rate. Where here we have a particular graphical representation of business cycles, where we have real GDP for the United States from 1960 until 2021 in the form of the percentage change from the preceding period. This allows us to remove that trend component dealing with economic growth and examine strictly the cyclical component, or business cycles, where here we have that real GDP in terms of the percentage change from the preceding period is fluctuating up and down at a non-constant rate around a particular value. This particular value that it's fluctuating around is that constant growth rate for the United States, which turns out to be about 3%. And we see that overall, since it's at a non-constant rate, it's rather noisy in terms of its periods of up and down. In terms of what we will be focusing our attention on, this is what we'll focus our framework for the aggregate product market on in terms of examining these short-run fluctuations, where the questions that we'll have are: when does the aggregate product market clear in the short run? When does the aggregate product market clear in the long run? Why is real GDP volatile in the short run? And how do changes in real GDP in the short run affect unemployment and inflation? So where we'll pick up in our next video is we'll focus our attention in terms of classifying components of the business cycle and look at some major schools of thought in economics in regards to the stability of these business cycles.